They didn't build chimneys here. There were no endless rows of barracks, no iron gates stamped into memory by photographs. If you stood in this place in 1941, you would have seen a quiet Polish village, a manor house, a forest road, and trucks coming and going. Nothing that looked like a death camp. And that was the point. Because at Chelmno, the killing didn't happen behind walls. It happened in motion. People arrived believing they were being relocated, told to undress, told to wait, told lies that sounded reasonable enough to obey. Minutes later, the truck doors closed. The engine started, and by the time the vehicle reached the forest, everyone inside was already dead. No shots, no screams heard by the outside world, just exhaust fumes, silence, and bodies piling up where no one could see them. This was not Auschwitz. This was not Treblinka. This was something earlier, quieter, more experimental. The place where the Nazis first proved to themselves that an entire population could be murdered efficiently, repeatedly, and almost invisibly. Chelmno was not designed to terrify its victims. It was designed to calm them. And in doing so, it became the blueprint for everything that followed. The truck slows as it turns off the main road, tires crunching over gravel, the engine idling too long in the cold. Somewhere behind the trees, water moves slowly through reeds, unseen but always present. A river breathing in the dark. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. This place does not feel dangerous. It feels ordinary. Too ordinary. A village where nothing important should ever happen, where history should pass by without stopping. And yet, within months, this quiet bend of land will become a proving ground for death, a place where murder will be refined, rehearsed, and perfected before it spreads across a continent. Before the war, Chelmno nad Narem is little more than a dot on a map, a village tucked into western Poland, surrounded by fields that change color with the seasons. In summer, wheat bends under warm winds. In winter, frost hardens the soil until footsteps echo sharply. Then a river runs nearby, shallow and slow, its banks muddy, its surface reflecting pale skies. It is not a river of trade or grandeur. It carries no ships, no wealth, no headlines. It simply exists, as the village exists, quietly, patiently, unnoticed. People here live close to the land. Farmers rise before dawn, hands stiff with cold, breath clouding the air as they step into barns. Children walk narrow paths to school, boots sinking into soft ground after rain. Church bells mark time more reliably than clocks. Life moves in cycles that feel permanent. Generations have lived and died here without the world caring very much. That anonymity feels like protection. No one imagines it could become an advantage for killers. The village itself is modest. A few dozen houses, dirt roads, a small church, and just beyond the center, a manor estate that once belonged to Polish nobility, its walls pale, its rooms echoing when empty. It is not a fortress. It is not isolated. It is simply there, close enough to roads, close enough to forest, close enough to water. At the time, no one sees what it offers. No one asks the question that will soon matter more than any other. How visible is this place to the world? When Germany invades Poland in September of 1939, the violence arrives quickly, brutally, and without apology. Bombs fall on cities far away, but the consequences reach even here. Within weeks, Western Poland is torn from the Polish state and absorbed directly into the German Reich. This region is renamed the WWII, a laboratory for Nazi racial policy. There is no pretense of occupation. This land is claimed as German, its people reduced to obstacles or raw material. German officials arrive with clipboards and maps. Signs change language. Streets are renamed. Polish officials disappear. Jewish families are registered, marked, isolated. What was once familiar begins to feel hostile. Soldiers march through villages not as temporary guests, but as owners. Their boots sound different on the ground. Heavier, more confident. In Chelmno, fear creeps in quietly. At first, it is uncertainty. Then it is restriction, curfews, confiscations, Whispers of deportations from nearby towns. Trains passing through stations that no longer feel neutral. The village watches events unfold from the edge, believing distance might still mean safety. It does not. What makes Chelmno valuable to the Nazi regime is not ideology. It is logistics, geography, silence. The village sits near the boundary between annexed German territory and the general government. It is close enough to Jewish populations marked for removal, yet far enough for major cities to avoid attention. Roads connect it easily to surrounding towns. Forests provide cover. The river offers disposal. And most importantly, there are few outsiders passing through who might ask questions. In Berlin, and in regional headquarters closer to the ground, Nazi officials are already wrestling with a problem of their own creation. Tens of thousands of Jews in the WWII are being concentrated into ghettos. Food is scarce. Disease spreads. Deportations eastward are discussed, delayed, revised. The question grows more urgent by the week. What to do with people the regime has already decided must not live? Mass shootings are being used further east, but they are messy. Bullets cost money. Soldiers break down. Villages see too much. There is a desire for something quieter, something contained, something that looks less like murder and more like process. Chelmno begins to appear in reports not as a village, but as a solution. The manor house stands empty by the time German authorities take interest. Its rooms are large enough to hold groups of people. Its location is ideal, close to a road, but shielded by trees. Nearby forests are thick, their floors soft, ready to be dug. This is not coincidence. This is selection. The local Polish population senses change before they understand it. Trucks begin to pass through more frequently. German personnel inspect buildings, paths, clearings. Orders are given. Areas are closed off. Questions are met with threats. The atmosphere thickens, like air before a storm that never quite breaks. By late 1941, Chelmno is no longer just a village. It is an experiment waiting to happen. The first of its kind. A place chosen not because of what it is, but because of what it is not. Not famous. Not crowded. Not watched. And as winter approaches, with frost sealing the ground and fog hanging low over the river, decisions made far away begin to narrow toward this quiet place. Trucks are prepared. Personnel are assigned. Methods are tested in theory. No announcements are made. No warnings are given. Life continues as usual on the surface, even as something unprecedented moves closer. The people of Chelmno do not know they are standing at the edge of a new chapter in human history. They do not know their village will soon be spoken of in whispers, then forgotten entirely, buried beneath the names of larger, louder camps. They only know that the roads are busier, the soldiers colder, and the silence heavier than before. And somewhere beyond the village, plans are finalizing, not for occupation, not for resettlement, but for a form of killing so efficient, so contained, that it can operate almost invisibly. A method that will not need fences or guard towers or gunfire echoing across fields. Soon, people will arrive here believing they're being moved to work. Soon, engines will run longer than necessary. Soon, the forest will begin to change. And when the first truck doors close, Chelmno will stop being a village at all. The border did not feel like a border at first. There was no dramatic crossing, no single moment when people could point and say that life had changed forever. Instead, it crept forward in paperwork, in uniforms, in new signs nailed over old ones. One morning, the language on official notices was different. Another morning, familiar officials were gone. By the time anyone fully understood what had happened, Western Poland was no longer occupied land. It had been absorbed, swallowed whole, declared German soil as if history itself could be erased with a stamp. The region was renamed the WWII, and with that name came a promise made quietly, but enforced brutally. This was not to be a temporary conquest. It was to be transformed, purified, remade. What happened here would not wait for the war to end. It would begin immediately, and it would move faster than anywhere else in Europe. The village of Chelmno, still trying to make sense of the new reality, now found itself inside one of the most radical experiments of the Nazi state. German administrators arrived with a sense of urgency that felt almost frantic. They did not behave like occupiers settling in. They behaved like engineers racing against time. Lists were drawn up. Property was cataloged. People were classified, measured, ranked. Who could stay? Who must go? Who was considered German enough to be useful? Who was considered a problem that needed to be removed? At the top of this system stood Arthur Greiser, the Reichsstatthalter of the WW2, a man determined to prove his loyalty and efficiency. Greiser did not want gradual change. He wanted results he could report upward, numbers he could present as evidence of ideological success. The WW2, in his vision, would become a model province, cleansed of Jews and Poles alike, reshaped into something that fit the racial fantasies of Nazi Germany. For the Jewish population, this shift was immediate and devastating. Restrictions tightened rapidly. Businesses were seized. Homes were confiscated. Families were forced into smaller and smaller spaces as ghettos were formed in nearby towns like Kolo and Lodz. Hunger became constant. Disease followed. Rumors traveled faster than official announcements, and none of them were good. What made the WW2 different from other occupied regions was speed. Elsewhere, Nazi policies unfolded in phases, constrained by military priorities or administrative confusion. Here, there was no such patience. The region was annexed directly into the Reich, meaning German racial law applied without delay. The question was no longer whether Jews would be removed, but how quickly it could be done. The answers being considered were not theoretical. They were brutally practical. Deportation eastward was discussed, but rail capacity was limited and priorities shifted constantly. Mass shootings were known, but they required manpower, ammunition, and left too many witnesses. The leadership wanted something cleaner, something that did not rely on soldiers pulling triggers day after day, something that could be explained in reports using euphemisms and numbers. In offices far from Chelmno, discussions circled around a chilling idea: killing as a logistical process. Not rage, not chaos, procedure. The kind of solution that could be repeated, scaled, and controlled. The WW2, with its dense Jewish population and tight administrative oversight, became the ideal place to try it. Meanwhile, life on the ground grew harsher by the week. German settlers were brought in to replace expelled Poles. Entire families were given hours to pack before being forced out of homes their ancestors had lived in for generations. Furniture was left behind. Livestock changed hands. The land itself seemed to be reassigned, as if people were interchangeable parts. In Chelmno, villagers watched trucks pass through carrying strangers guarded by armed men. They heard about disappearances in neighboring towns. They noticed that questions were no longer safe to ask. The village was not yet targeted, but it was no longer neutral. It had been folded into a system that was accelerating toward something no one could quite name. The Jewish ghettos nearby were bursting beyond capacity. Food rations shrank until they were little more than symbolic. Children grew thin. Elderly people collapsed in the streets. German officials walked through these areas not with concern, but with impatience. These people were no longer seen as human beings in crisis. They were viewed as a problem waiting to be solved. The language used in reports reflected this shift. Words like evacuation, resettlement, special treatment began appearing with increasing frequency. They sounded bureaucratic, harmless even. But behind them was a growing consensus that removal meant death, whether it was spoken aloud or not. By the autumn of 1941, the pressure reached a breaking point. The invasion of the Soviet Union had begun months earlier, and with it, mass shootings in the East had shown that killing on an industrial scale was possible. But those methods were deemed unsuitable for the WW2. Too visible, too loud, too psychologically damaging to the men ordered to carry them out. What the region needed was discretion, a way to eliminate entire groups without drawing attention, without leaving bodies in public spaces, without the chaos of gunfire. The solution did not need to be hidden forever. It only needed to remain unseen long enough to work. Chelmno began to reappear in conversations, not as a village, but as a location. its proximity to roads, its distance from major population centers, its manor house, its forest, its river. Each feature was discussed not for its beauty or history, but for its utility. This was how places became tools. Orders were passed down quietly. Preparations began under the cover of routine administrative work. Buildings were requisitioned. Local poles were warned away from certain areas. Guards were assigned. Everything was framed as temporary, as necessary for the war effort. No one was told the truth, because no one needed to be. The men selected to run what was coming were chosen carefully. They were not frontline soldiers. They were administrators, technicians, drivers. Men who could follow instructions, who could compartmentalize, who could treat death as a task rather than a moral event. They arrived without fanfare, blending into the existing occupation forces. As winter approached, the WW2 was already changing beyond recognition. The Jewish population had been stripped of rights, property, and hope. The Polish population had been reduced to labor and silence. German officials spoke openly about achieving racial goals ahead of schedule. The region was becoming exactly what its leaders wanted: efficient, obedient, and ruthless. And Chelmno sat quietly within it, still outwardly unchanged. Smoke still rose from chimneys. The river still flowed. The forest still stood. But beneath the surface, it had been selected, marked not on public maps, but in internal documents that would never be meant for history books. Soon, the question of what to do with the people in the ghettos would no longer be debated. Soon, the solution would no longer be theoretical. The WW2 was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. And when it did, Chelmno would no longer be just a place on the edge of the system. It would become the place where the system learned how to kill without being seen. The decisions were not made in a single room or on a single day. They emerged slowly from a pressure that kept building until it could no longer be contained. In offices across the WW2, reports piled up describing ghettos that were overcrowded beyond function, populations deemed unproductive, mouths that consumed resources without contributing to the war. The language was cold, clipped, administrative. It reduced human beings to figures that did not balance. And once the math no longer worked, the conclusion followed with terrifying inevitability. At first, the problem was framed as temporary. The ghettos were supposed to be holding zones, way stations before some future solution arrived. But weeks turned into months, and no solution appeared. Food deliveries fell behind. Typhus spread through cramped rooms. The smell of sickness and waste hung over entire neighborhoods. German officials visiting these places did not see suffering. They saw inefficiency. They saw disorder. They saw evidence that the existing system was failing to keep pace with ideology. The invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941 changed everything. In the East, killing was no longer hypothetical. Entire communities were being wiped out by gunfire, bodies falling into ravines and pits. Reports came back describing actions carried out by special units. Tens of thousands dead in weeks. It was proof that mass murder was possible, but it also revealed something else, something the leadership did not like to admit openly. The men doing the shooting were breaking. Commanders complained of nerves shattered by endless executions. Soldiers drank heavily. Some refused orders. Others carried out the killings mechanically, then collapsed afterward. The work was effective, but costly in ways that did not appear on balance sheets. For a regime obsessed with control, this was unacceptable. In the WW2, where everything was supposed to be orderly and Germanized, mass shootings were considered too crude, too visible, too chaotic. Bullets left evidence. Gunfire attracted attention. Graves were difficult to conceal. And perhaps most importantly, it required perpetrators to confront their victims face to face, again and again, day after day. What began to take shape instead was an idea both simpler and more terrifying. If the act of killing could be separated from the act of seeing death, then the psychological burden could be reduced. If murder could be turned into a process, then it could be repeated without pause, without reflection, without resistance. The question became not whether to kill, but how to do it efficiently. Discussions turned toward methods already tested in other contexts. Carbon monoxide had been used before, quietly, in institutions where the disabled were murdered under the guise of medical care. Those killings had been carried out indoors, away from public view. Their victims reduced to patients, their deaths recorded as natural. The technology existed. The principle was proven. What remained was adaptation. Fixed facilities posed a problem. Building permanent structures took time. It left traces. It required workers who might talk. The WW2 needed something faster, something that could be assembled and dismantled without leaving scars on the landscape. Something that could move. The idea of mobile killing units began to circulate. Trucks modified so that exhaust fumes could be redirected into sealed compartments. Vehicles that looked ordinary from the outside, blending into the endless traffic of war. No firing squads. No mass graves visible from the road. Just engines running a little longer than usual. To the men discussing this, it sounded elegant, practical, humane, in the warped logic of perpetrators who measured mercy by silence rather than survival. Victims would lose consciousness quickly, they argued. There would be no blood, no struggle. Death would come without spectacle. Once this line of thinking took hold, the remaining questions were logistical. Where could such a method be tested? Where could it operate without interruption? Where would mistakes go unnoticed? The WW2 offered the answer. Its Jewish population had already been isolated. Its administration was centralized. Its leadership was eager to demonstrate results. And within it lay places like Chelmno, where roads, forests, and distance combined into something dangerously convenient. As planning accelerated, language shifted again. Orders avoided words like killing or death. Instead, they spoke of special treatment, of evacuation measures, of solutions to the Jewish question. This was not secrecy born of shame. It was secrecy born of efficiency. Words were chosen to keep the machinery running smoothly, without friction. Men were selected to carry out the work, not for ideological fanaticism alone, but for temperament. Drivers who could keep engines steady. Guards who could follow instructions without curiosity. Supervisors who understood that questions were obstacles. These were not executioners in the traditional sense. They were operators. Meanwhile, life in the ghettos worsened. Entire families were squeezed into single rooms. Food rations fell to starvation levels. People sold their last possessions for scraps of bread. Children learned to stand still for hours to conserve energy. Every day felt like a waiting room for something unspoken but inevitable. Rumors spread, but they were fragmented, contradictory. Some spoke of labor camps. Others whispered of death. Many clung to the belief that anything was better than remaining where they were. The human mind, pushed to the edge, seeks hope even when evidence argues otherwise. By late autumn, the decision had effectively been made. The WW2 would not wait for larger extermination camps to be built elsewhere. It would act now. The method would be tested here, refined here, perfected here. If it worked, it could be replicated. If it failed, it could be erased. Chelmno, still outwardly unchanged, became the focal point of these plans. The manor house could serve as a reception site. The nearby forest could hide what followed. Trucks could travel back and forth without attracting suspicion. Then a river flowed patiently nearby, ready to carry away traces that could not be buried. Everything about the location aligned with the requirements of this new approach to murder. And once that alignment was recognized, hesitation vanished. Preparations began quietly. Vehicles were modified. Procedures were drafted. Timelines were set. The system was not yet running, but it was already alive, taking shape in documents, in conversations, in the minds of those who would soon put into motion. What made this moment different from everything that had come before was intention. This was not violence spiraling out of control. It was violence brought under control. Killing is policy. Death is output. The people of Chelmno did not hear these discussions. They did not see the paperwork or the diagrams. They only noticed more trucks, more guards, more areas closed off without explanation. The forest paths they had known since childhood were suddenly forbidden. The manor house, once a landmark, became a place no one was allowed to approach. The village felt like it was holding its breath. By the time the first victims would arrive, the system would already be in place, waiting. The method chosen, the roles assigned, the moral boundaries crossed so completely that they no longer appeared in the minds of those enforcing them. And when the engines finally started, it would not feel like an outbreak of violence. It would feel like the beginning of routine. The engine sound was the first thing perfected. Not the killing, not the secrecy, but the noise. It had to be familiar, ordinary. The low mechanical rumble of a truck idling on a cold morning, something no one would stop to question. In wartime, engines were everywhere. Trucks carried supplies, soldiers, furniture, fuel. They passed through villages constantly. The sound blended into daily life. And that was exactly why it was chosen. The idea of killing without a fixed place demanded movement. Movement disguised purpose. A vehicle could arrive, depart, return, and no one would know what had happened inside. There would be no firing squads to see, no blood on the ground, no screams echoing across fields. The act of murder would take place while the truck was already on the road, hidden by distance and time. By the moment it stopped, death would already be complete. The vehicles themselves were unremarkable. Medium-sized trucks, similar to those already in use by German forces. Their appearance mattered. They could not look special. They could not attract attention. Only inside did they differ. The cargo compartments were sealed, reinforced, altered just enough to prevent air from escaping. Exhaust pipes were redirected. The design was crude but effective, born not from engineering brilliance, but from urgency. Carbon monoxide became the weapon of choice because it required no new infrastructure. It was already being produced by the engine. It did not stain walls. It did not leave obvious wounds. Victims would grow dizzy, lose consciousness, suffocate quietly. To the men who authorized this method, it seemed efficient, clean, almost humane, a word that still appeared in internal justifications without irony. The first trials were not announced as trials. They were described as operational tests, routine checks. Drivers were instructed carefully. Speeds were calculated. Time intervals were noted. How long before silence? How long before unloading could begin? These questions were not philosophical. They were procedural. What mattered most was reliability. The system had to work every time. If the engine stalled, if seals leaked, if victims survived longer than expected, the entire premise collapsed. Too much noise, too much panic, too much unpredictability. So adjustments were made. Gaskets tightened. Instructions refined. Nothing was left to chance except the lives being extinguished inside. The men involved learned quickly how to distance themselves from what they were doing. The compartment was closed. The doors were locked. Once sealed, the people inside ceased to exist as individuals. They became cargo. The driver did not see faces. He heard nothing once the engine noise rose. His task was simply to drive. This separation was intentional. It allowed perpetrators to avoid the moment of death. No trigger pulled. No eye contact at the final second. The killing happened somewhere behind them, in a space they did not have to acknowledge. Responsibility became abstract. Everyone was only doing a part. Word of this method spread quietly within select circles. Not openly, not proudly, but with a sense of grim satisfaction. It solved multiple problems at once. It spared manpower. It spared ammunition. It spared the nerves of those assigned to kill. And most importantly, it kept the surrounding population largely unaware. The WWII leadership watched closely. This was not just about eliminating Jews from the region. It was about proving that mass murder could be integrated into daily operations without disruption, that it could become background noise. Chelmno was now fully integrated into this plan. The manor house would serve as the intake point, a place where people could be gathered calmly, processed, and handed over to the trucks. The force would receive what remained. The road between them would become the corridor of death. The first victims would not arrive knowing any of this. They would be told they were being resettled, that they needed a bathe, that they would be taken to work. The deception was crucial. Panic slowed everything down. Calm made the system run smoothly. Guards were instructed to maintain order not through brutality, but through reassurance. Soft voices, clear instructions, a tone that suggested authority, not cruelty. The more ordinary the process felt, the easier it became to complete. Inside the truck, there was no ceremony, no last words, no recognition. People were packed tightly, standing shoulder to shoulder, pressed against metal walls that were already cold. The door closed with a heavy sound. Bolts slid into place. The engine revved. Carbon monoxide filled the compartment invisibly. It had no smell that could warn them. Dizziness came first. Confusion. Legs buckled. People fell, piling on top of one another. Within minutes, movement slowed, then stopped. By the time the truck reached the forest, the driver could be confident that his task was complete. He did not need a check. He did not need a look. The schedule mattered more than the result. The result was assumed. In the forest, another group took over. Bodies were unloaded, sometimes still warm, sometimes already stiff. Gold teeth were removed. Hair was cut. Clothing was sorted. The physical labor was heavy, exhausting, relentless. These men could not avoid what they were doing. Their proximity to death was unavoidable. And because of that, they were considered disposable. The gas vans returned to the manor house again and again. Each trip refined the process. Timings improved. Bottlenecks were eliminated. What began as an experiment quickly hardened into routine. This was not yet an industrial extermination camp with chimneys and rail platforms. It was something more fluid, more adaptable, a system that could operate wherever roads existed. What made it especially dangerous was its invisibility. Entire transports could disappear without leaving a trace in public spaces. No crowds gathered. No smoke rose above rooftops. The village continued to function around it, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was happening just beyond its edges. Even among German personnel, details were compartmentalized. Drivers did not need to know where victims came from. Guards did not need to know what happened in the forest. Supervisors focused on efficiency metrics. The system protected itself by ensuring no one saw the whole picture. As word spread through ghettos that transports were leaving and never returning, fear intensified. But certainty was still elusive. The absence of bodies, the lack of visible violence, made the truth harder to grasp. Hope lingered where it should not have. For the leadership, the success of the gas vans confirmed something crucial. Killing could be mechanized without fixed infrastructure. Murder could travel. It could be deployed wherever needed. And most importantly, it could be denied. Chelmno was no longer just a test site. It was proof of concept. And with that proof came ambition. If this worked here, it could work elsewhere. On a larger scale. With greater speed. With fewer witnesses. The engines kept running. The roads kept carrying trucks back and forth. The forest absorbed what it was given. And, as the method stabilized, attention shifted from how to kill to how many could be killed, how quickly, and how long the system could operate before anyone outside the circle truly understood what was happening. The quiet village had become a machine in motion, and it would not stop on its own. By the time the system settled into rhythm, the village itself no longer mattered. Chelmno had been transformed without announcing the change, without fences or signs or declarations. It did not become a camp in the way people later imagined camps. It became something quieter and more dangerous, a process anchored to a place that looked ordinary enough to be ignored, even as it swallowed thousands of lives. The manor house stood at the center of it, its pale walls unchanged, its windows still framing the same winter light. To an outsider, it looked like a requisition building like so many others under occupation. Inside, it had been stripped of personality and repurposed with intent. Furniture was removed. Rooms were cleared. The echo of footsteps grew sharper as space emptied. This was not renovation. It was preparation. The entrance was chosen carefully. People would arrive through a gate that did not feel threatening. Guards stood nearby, but not in tight formation. Weapons were present, but not raised. The atmosphere was designed to suggest authority, not danger. Order, not violence. The moment people sensed chaos, the system slowed. Calm was essential. When transport arrived, they were not called transports. They were arrivals. Groups were brought in from nearby ghettos, told they were being moved for work, resettlement, sanitation. The lies were not elaborate. They did not need to be. They only needed to sound plausible enough to delay panic. Exhausted, starving, desperate people were primed to believe almost anything that promised survival. Inside the manor, instructions were delivered in firm, controlled voices. Shoes here. Coats there. Valuables collected for safekeeping. Names recorded. Sometimes. Not always. The pretense of bureaucracy added legitimacy. People complied because compliance had been trained into them by months of ghetto life. Obedience had become a survival instinct. The rooms filled with the sounds of movement. Fabric brushing fabric. The dull thud of shoes on the floor. Quiet murmurs. Occasionally a child cried, quickly hushed by a parent afraid of attracting attention. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with cold air and old plaster. There was nothing dramatic in these moments. That was part of the design. The guards inside the manor had a specific role. They were not to shout unless necessary, not to strike unless order broke down. Violence was inefficient here. It created resistance. The goal was flow. People in, people out. No bottlenecks. No disruptions. Once stripped, groups were moved toward the trucks waiting outside. The transition was meant to feel temporary, like a step in a larger process. A short ride, a bath, a registration point. The victims were told exactly what they needed to hear at that moment. The truth was never required. The trucks waited close enough to the manor to minimize exposure, but not so close as to cause suspicion. Their engines were already running. Steam rose faintly in the cold air. Drivers remained at their posts, focused, silent. This was no longer an experiment. This was routine. Once inside the cargo compartment, people were packed tightly. The door closed. Bolts slid into place. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. A truck, idling. A driver waiting. The engine noise grew, slightly louder, as the vehicle pulled away. From the manor house, nothing could be heard. The killing happened elsewhere, along the road, in motion. This separation was critical. It allowed the intake process to continue uninterrupted. One group could be processed while another was already dying out of sight. The forest site completed the system. Located several kilometers away, it was dense enough to hide activity, but accessible enough to allow repeated trips. Paths were cleared just enough for vehicles to pass. Pits were dug deep into the soft ground. At first, bodies were buried quickly, stacked, covered, hidden beneath layers of earth that would soon freeze solid. The men assigned to this work were isolated from everyone else. They lived apart, ate apart, slept under guard. Their exposure to death was constant, unavoidable. And because of that, they were considered temporary. Tools that would be discarded once worn down. The smell in the forest changed over time. Fresh earth gave way to something heavier, sweeter, unmistakable. Even in winter, it lingered. Those who worked there learned not to breathe too deeply, not to think about what they were touching. Hands moved automatically. Shovels bit into soil. Bodies were lifted, dropped, covered. Again and again. As weeks passed, the volume increased. What had been tested cautiously now accelerated. Transports arrived daily, sometimes more than one per day. Schedules tightened. Delays were criticized. Efficiency reports circulated. Numbers mattered. Time mattered. The village noticed changes, even if it did not understand them. Trucks passed more frequently. Certain roads were closed permanently. Armed guards appeared in places that had once been open fields. People learned which paths to avoid, which questions not to ask. Survival meant adaptation. Rumors spread, but they were incomplete, fragmented. Some villagers sensed that people were being killed. Others believed they were being moved elsewhere. The absence of visible violence made certainty impossible, and uncertainty bred silence. Within the Nazi administration, Chelmno was spoken of less and less as a place, and more as a function. It was no longer experimental. It was operational, a solution that worked. But even a working system produced problems. The mass graves filled faster than anticipated. The ground shifted. Odors intensified. In warmer months, decomposition accelerated. The forest began to betray what it concealed. This prompted another shift, another refinement. Bodies already buried were exhumed. Pyres were built. Wood was stacked. Fires burned for days at a time. Smoke rose into the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of burning flesh. Even here, secrecy had limits. The work grew more frantic. Evidence had to be destroyed as quickly as it was created. The system was no longer just about killing. It was about erasing. Inside the manor house, the process continued unchanged. People arrived believing the same lies. They followed the same instructions. They stepped into the same trucks. The system depended on repetition, on the fact that each group knew nothing of the one before. What made Chelmno uniquely dangerous was its invisibility. There were no trains unloading crowds onto platforms, no massive structures dominating the skyline, no obvious sign that tens of thousands were being murdered in this quiet place. Even those who suspected often lacked the proof needed to fully believe it. As the months passed, the system hardened. Roles became fixed. Procedures were memorized. Deviations were corrected. This was no longer improvisation. It was a machine. The manor house, once a symbol of local history, had become the mouth of that machine. The forest, its stomach. The road between them, its throat. And as this machinery proved itself capable of killing continuously without attracting widespread attention, it sent a message upward through the Nazi hierarchy. A message not written in words, but in results. This could be done. Not just here. Not just now. Something far larger was already forming beyond Chelmno, drawing lessons from what worked and what failed. Plans were evolving. Facilities were being designed. Methods were being scaled. Chelmno had shown the way. And as the system tightened its grip on this quiet village, the next phase of killing was already taking shape elsewhere, informed by everything that had been learned here, in silence, in motion, in a place the world barely knew existed. They arrived without knowing they were the first. That distinction belonged only to history, not to them. To the people stepping off carts and trucks in the winter air, Chelmno was simply another stop imposed by forces they no longer tried to understand. Their world had already been reduced so many times that this moment felt like just another narrowing, another turn in a road that never led back to what had been lost. Most of them came from nearby towns. From Kolo, from small villages whose Jewish communities had existed for centuries and were now being dismantled in weeks. Families who had lived above their shops. Elders who still remembered the First World War. Children who had learned to stay quiet when soldiers passed. They were not criminals. They were not fighters. They were neighbors, clerks, tailors, bakers. People whose lives had once been defined by routine, now compressed into survival. The journey to Chelmno was short, and that made it easier to believe the lies. This was not a long deportation eastward. There were no trains rattling for days. No unfamiliar landscapes sliding past windows. The proximity created plausibility. Work assignments nearby. Temporary relocation. A processing center. Something bureaucratic. Something survivable. The guards who escorted them did not scream. They did not beat them into motion. Their tone was firm, official, almost bored. Papers were checked. Groups were counted. Instructions were given in clipped phrases. Efficiency mattered more than cruelty at this stage. Panic slowed things down. When the first groups entered the manor house, the building itself did part of the work. It looked legitimate, solid, permanent, not like a place of execution. People are conditioned to associate danger with chaos. Chelmno offered structure instead. Inside, they were told to undress. Not violently, not all at once. Room by room. Shoes here, coats there. Valuables collected and labeled. Some were told they would get them back after bathing. Others were told they were being disinfected before resettlement. These explanations shifted slightly depending on who was listening, but the effect was the same. Delay, confusion, compliance. For many, undressing in front of strangers was already humiliating enough that they focused on that discomfort rather than the larger fear gnawing at them. Shame is a powerful distraction. It keeps people inward, quiet, obedient. The air inside the rooms was heavy. Bodies pressed close together, breath fogging the windows. The smell of sweat and fear layered over months of hunger and illness. People clutched bundles of clothing instinctively, reluctant to let go of the last physical proof of their lives. Guards pried fingers loose when necessary, not roughly, just firmly, as one would remove an object from a reluctant child. Children asked questions adults could not answer. Where are we going? When will we eat? Why do we have to take off our clothes? Parents whispered reassurances they did not believe themselves. Anything to keep calm. Anything to avoid drawing attention. Outside, the trucks waited. The first time the doors closed on a full load of people, the moment passed almost unnoticed by those still inside the manor. They heard the engine. They felt the vibration through the floor. A sound so common in wartime that it barely registered. The truck pulled away. Another would soon take its place. Those who were killed on those first days had no warning. There were no rumors yet, no stories of disappearance, no survivors to whisper the truth. This was the opening act, when the system still relied entirely on ignorance. In the forest, the work began immediately. Bodies were unloaded in silence, broken only by the scrape of boots in mud and the dull impact of flesh against earth. Some faces were still contorted, some mouths open, as if frozen midward. Others looked strangely peaceful, emptied of tension. Death by carbon monoxide did not leave dramatic wounds. It left absence. The men who handled the bodies worked quickly. They had been told to. Speed prevented thought. Hesitation invited punishment. The faster they moved, the sooner the task would be over, at least for that moment. Pits swallowed the dead. Shovels moved. Earth covered everything. Back at the manor, the process repeated. By the end of the first day, the system had proven itself. No riots. No mass resistance. No delays significant enough to matter. The trucks ran on schedule. The forest absorbed what it was given. The village remained quiet. This success encouraged expansion. Within days, transports increased. Entire sections of nearby ghettos were emptied. Families were told they were being moved to better conditions. Sick people were prioritized under the pretense of medical care. Elderly people were reassured that the journey would be short. Lies were tailored to vulnerability. As word spread that people were leaving and never returning, fear sharpened. But without evidence, fear could not organize itself. It remained a whisper, a knot in the stomach, not yet a scream. Some suspected death. Others clung to hope. Hope, even false hope, kept order intact. The killing of these first victims revealed something else to the perpetrators. The system could handle scale. It did not collapse under volume. In fact, it seemed to improve. With repetition came efficiency. Guards became more confident, drivers more precise, timings more predictable. Chelmno was no longer operating at the edge of possibility. It was settling into routine. The local Polish population began to sense that something irreversible was happening. They saw columns of people entering the manor and never leaving. They noticed clothing piles growing, then disappearing. They smelled the forest on certain days, a smell that did not belong to wood or earth alone. But fear and occupation taught people how to look away. Survival required silence. Inside the ghettos, anxiety reached a breaking point. People debated whether to hide, whether to comply, whether to resist. But resistance required weapons, organization, and unity. Hunger had eroded all three. The system had been designed to arrive after months of deprivation, when bodies were weak and spirits exhausted. Those who tried to hide were often discovered. Informants were rewarded. Entire families were punished for individual defiance. Each act of resistance was used as justification for harsher measures, reinforcing the illusion that compliance offered safety. For the Nazis, these first victims were not remembered as people. They were remembered as numbers, as proof that the method worked. Reports noted the absence of complications, the lack of public disturbance, the minimal psychological strain on personnel compared to shooting operations. This feedback mattered. It shaped decisions beyond Chelmno. It validated an approach to killing that emphasized distance, process, and control. Meanwhile, The forest pits filled. As winter turned to spring, new problems emerged. The ground softened. Graves shifted. Fluids seeped upward. The earth could not fully contain what it held. Animals were drawn to the disturbed soil. The forest began to reveal hints of what lay beneath. This did not stop the killing. It forced adaptation. Bodies already buried were dug up and burned. Fires crackled day and night. Smoke curled through branches. Ash settled on leaves. The smell traveled farther than expected. Even those who try not to think about it could no longer deny that something unnatural was happening. Yet still, the system continued. The first victims of Chelmno were erased twice. First in death, then in memory. Their names were not recorded. Their families did not know where they had gone. Their absence became just another blank space in a world already full of them. And this erasure was itself a lesson learned by the perpetrators. Killing was not enough. Traces had to be removed. Evidence had to vanish. The process would have to evolve again. But for now, the machine ran. Each day followed the last with terrifying sameness. Arrival, undressing, trucks, forest, return, repeat. The village lived alongside it, frozen between knowledge and denial. What began with the first victims did not end with them. It opened a floodgate. Once killing became routine, once death fit neatly into schedules and reports, there was nothing to slow it. And as Chelmno absorbed these early transports, the scope of what was being planned expanded beyond local ghettos. Larger populations, larger numbers, longer timelines. The system had proven itself capable of beginning something that would not remain contained. And as the first victims disappeared into the forest soil, unseen and unnamed, the machinery of mass murder was already turning toward its next targets, confident now that it could kill not just once, but endlessly. By this point, nothing about the process felt accidental anymore. What had once been tentative, tested in fragments, now moved with a grim confidence. The killing at Chelmno no longer depended on improvisation or instinct. It followed a sequence so precise that every man involved knew his place in it, even if he pretended not to understand the whole. Murder had been broken down into steps, and each step was timed, repeated, and refined until hesitation disappeared. The day usually began before the victims arrived. Guards took their positions. The manor house was checked, rooms cleared, doors unlocked in the correct order. The trucks were inspected mechanically, not morally. Engines warmed. Seals were tested. The forest detail prepared pits or pyres, depending on the season and the current stage of concealment. Everything was done quietly, efficiently, as if preparing for ordinary labor. When transports arrived, the tone was already set. The guards understood that the first minutes mattered more than anything that followed. Panic at the beginning could ripple through the entire system. Calm ensured cooperation. So voices remained level. Orders were given as instructions, not threats. The language used was deliberate, temporary, necessary, for hygiene, for work, for registration. Victims were led inside the manor house in groups small enough to manage, large enough to maintain pace. The building itself shaped behavior. Its walls closed in sound. Its hallways directed movement. People naturally followed where they were guided, trusting structure over instinct. This trust, even when thin, was enough. Undressing was always the most vulnerable moment. Clothing is identity. Removing it strips away not just fabric, but dignity, memory, resistance. The perpetrators understood this intuitively, even if they never articulated it. Once people stood exposed, clutching each other for warmth, resistance became psychologically harder. Shame replaced defiance. Fear turned inward. Instructions were repeated calmly. Shoes paired together. Glasses placed aside. Jewelry handed over. Everything was presented as temporary. The illusion of order kept people compliant, even as unease grew heavier with every passing minute. At no point were people told they were about to die. The system did not require confession. It required belief, or at least uncertainty. As long as doubt remained, the machinery could keep moving. When the moment came to move outside, the transition was framed as routine. A short walk, A short ride. Guards positioned themselves to prevent sudden movement, but not so obviously that it appeared threatening. The trucks were close now, engines running, exhaust visible in the cold air. The loading was done quickly. People were guided up into the cargo compartment, pressed together to maximize capacity. The interior was dark, the walls metal, the air already thin. The door closed behind the last person with a sound that echoed louder than intended, a final mechanical punctuation. Once sealed, everything changed. Inside the compartment, confusion erupted almost immediately. Darkness disoriented. The sudden lack of space triggered instinctive panic. People pushed. Children cried. Adults shouted questions that had no answers. Then the gas began to take effect. Carbon monoxide has no warning smell. It does not burn the lungs. It does not announce itself. It simply replaces oxygen silently. Dizziness came first. Heads grew light. Knees weakened. Panic turned into disorientation. Voices faltered. People collapsed where they stood, falling into one another. Those at the bottom were crushed under the weight of bodies, losing control. Breathing became labored, then shallow, then absent. Within minutes, movement slowed to sporadic twitching. Then nothing. Outside, none of this could be seen. The driver focused on the road. The engine noise covered everything. The killing happened invisibly, carried along by momentum. By the time the truck reached the forest, death was assumed. The door was opened only after sufficient time had passed. Even then, guards approached carefully, watching for signs of movement. Occasionally, someone survived longer than expected. When that happened, it was handled quickly, quietly. Deviations were corrected. Procedures adjusted. The unloading was brutal in its simplicity. Bodies were dragged out, often tangled together, limbs stiffening as cold air hit them. Faces were blue or gray. Eyes open or closed, it made no difference. At this stage, individuality was gone. The dead were handled as mass. Jewish prisoners assigned to this work were forced to strip the bodies, search them, remove valuables. Their proximity to death was absolute. There was no distance, no abstraction. They touched what the others never had to see. And because they saw too much, they were never meant to survive long. The forest bore witness to everything. Soil darkened. Trees absorbed sound. Birds fled the immediate area. Fires crackled when burning began, sending smoke through branches that had once only known seasons and rain. Once the bodies were disposed of, the truck returned. The compartment was hosed down, sometimes crudely, sometimes thoroughly. The smell lingered no matter what was done. But smell was not considered evidence in reports. It could be dismissed, explained away, ignored. Back at the manor house, the next group was already waiting. What made this system particularly effective was its segmentation. No one man performed all the steps. Responsibility was diluted. Drivers drove. Guards guarded. Laborers labored. Supervisors supervised. Each could tell himself that he was only doing his part, that the true act of killing belonged somewhere else. This fragmentation was intentional. It allowed ordinary men to participate in extraordinary crimes without confronting their totality. The system did not demand ideological passion. It demanded obedience. As days passed, small refinements were introduced. Loading procedures adjusted to prevent early collapse near doors. Driving speeds calibrated for optimal exposure time. Forest disposal methods revised to increase capacity. These changes were discussed clinically, without emotion, as one might discuss improving a production line. The repetition had a numbing effect. What initially shocked some perpetrators soon became normal. The human mind adapts frighteningly fast when survival, promotion, or punishment are at stake. Killing became background noise. For the victims, this routinization meant something else. It meant that each group faced the same fate regardless of who they were or what they had done. There were no exceptions, no negotiations, no appeals. The system did not care about individuals. It cared about throughput. Inside the ghettos, the pattern began to emerge. People noticed that transports followed a rhythm. Certain days, certain numbers, certain categories. The sick first, then the elderly, then entire families. The The logic was cruel, but discernible. Some tried to hide. Some tried to flee. Most could not. Hunger and fear had already weakened them. The system had been designed to arrive after that weakening had done its work. At Chelmno, the killing process now functioned with terrifying smoothness. From arrival to disposal, the timeline was predictable. There were no mass shootings to alert the countryside. No dramatic scenes to force recognition. Just engines, mud, paperwork, smoke. This predictability emboldened those in charge. If death could be managed this quietly, why stop? Why limit the scope? The success of Chelmno did not satisfy demand. It expanded it. What began as a solution to a regional problem was becoming proof that mass murder could be administered without chaos, without visible atrocity, without immediate consequence. And as the process settled into this deadly rhythm, attention shifted once again, not to whether killing should continue, but to how long it could remain hidden, and what would need to change when the forest, the soil, and even silence itself began to give way under the weight of what they were being forced to contain. The machine was working too well, and because it worked, it would not be allowed to remain small. They were chosen because they could not refuse. That was the only qualification that mattered. Strength, age, skill, none of it guaranteed survival. What mattered was vulnerability. The men forced into this role were prisoners already stripped of rights, already starving, already trapped inside a system designed to erase them. Now they were given a task that made erasure inevitable. At Chelmno, the killing could not function without hands. Engines and gas could end lives, but bodies did not move themselves. Graves did not dig themselves. Fires did not build themselves. For that, the system required labor, and it found it among those it intended to destroy last. The Jewish prisoners selected for this work were separated from transports before the trucks arrived. They were pulled aside, told they had been chosen for labor, for temporary survival. The implication was clear, even if the words were not spoken. Work meant life, at least for now. In a world where death was the rule, even a fragile exception felt like hope. They were housed apart from the rest of the camp's operations, guarded constantly, isolated from the outside world. Contact with villagers was forbidden. Contact with incoming victims was limited and controlled. The purpose of this isolation was not just security. It was containment of knowledge. These men saw too much. They understood what Chelmno was. And because they understood, they could not be allowed to exist freely. Their work began in the forest. When the trucks arrived, the doors were opened carefully. Sometimes the bodies spilled out, tangled and stiff, having collapsed together in the final moments. Other times they had to be dragged free, limbs locked by cold and death. The prisoners learned quickly not to hesitate. Guards watched closely. Any sign of slowing down was punished. The physical weight of the bodies was crushing. Adults, children, elders, all pressed together. Fingers bent at unnatural angles. Skin cold to the touch, even when death was recent. The smell clung to everything, sweet and metallic, impossible to wash away. It settled into clothes, hair, lungs. It followed them into sleep. The prisoners stripped the bodies methodically. Clothing removed. Shoes separated. Pockets searched. Jewelry collected. Gold teeth pried for mouths with tools that were never cleaned properly. Hair cut when ordered. Nothing was considered sacred. Everything was inventory. The guards treated this work as routine. They stood nearby smoking, joking, checking watches. Their boredom was perhaps the most devastating detail. This was not rage. This was not frenzy. This was a job. Once stripped, the bodies were buried in mass graves during the early phase. Pits widened and deepened until they resembled open wounds in the earth. The prisoners lowered bodies layer by layer, arranging them to maximize space. Earth was shoveled back over them quickly. There was no ceremony, no marking. The dead vanished into anonymity. At night, the prisoners were marched back to their quarters under guard. They ate what little they were given in silence. Speech was dangerous. Talking about the work invited madness. Talking about the future invited despair. Many learned to speak as little as possible. Sleep brought no escape. Dreams replayed the day's work in fragments. Faces appeared without names. Hands reached upward through soil. Engines roared endlessly. Waking brought the realization that the same tasks would repeat. As weeks passed, the nature of the work changed. The mass graves became a liability. The ground shifted. Gases escaped. Animals disturbed shallow earth. The forest could not hide everything forever. Orders came down to remove the evidence. The prisoners were forced to exhume the bodies they had buried. The process was worse than the first burial. Flesh had decayed. Bones separated. Clothing fused to skin. The smell was overpowering, choking, impossible to escape even briefly. Some men vomited uncontrollably. They were beaten until they continued. Fires were built using railway tracks, wood, and fuel. Bodies were stacked like fuel themselves. The prisoners learned how to arrange them so they would burn faster, hotter. Fat from the corpses fueled the flames once they caught. Smoke rose day and night, carrying ash into the trees, into the air, into the lungs of everyone nearby. This was not done once. It was done repeatedly. Entire burial sites were emptied and burned. The prisoners worked until their hands blistered and bled. Gloves were rarely provided. Skin split. Infections followed. Weakness was met with punishment or replacement. Replacement was always waiting. The men understood their position clearly. They were not meant to survive. Their labor existed to bridge a gap between killing and concealment. Once their usefulness ended, so would their lives. This knowledge hung over every moment, shaping every decision. Some tried to survive by becoming indispensable, by working faster, by following orders perfectly, by avoiding attention. Others survived by emotional numbing, by shutting down any response that acknowledged what they were doing. Both strategies had limits. Occasionally, new prisoners were brought in to replace those who had died or been executed. These newcomers learned the truth quickly. There was no point in hiding it. They saw the bodies. They smelled the fires. Understanding came instantly and irreversibly. The guards encouraged division among the prisoners. Favoritism was used as control. A slightly larger ration. A moment of rest. A spared beating. These small mercies created resentment and competition, eroding solidarity that might otherwise have turned into resistance. And yet, even here, resistance flickered. Small acts first. Slowing down work when possible. Damaging tools subtly. Whispering warnings to incoming victims when guards were distracted. These acts were dangerous and rarely successful, but they mattered to those who carried them out. They were attempts to reclaim agency in a place designed to erase it. The psychological toll was immense. The prisoners were forced to violate every moral boundary they had known, not by choice, but by coercion. Survivors later described the feeling as being buried alive alongside their victims, suffocating under guilt that was not theirs but felt inescapable. The system relied on this guilt. It crushed resistance. It kept men compliant. A prisoner who believed himself already damned was less likely to rebel. Chelmno's killing machine functioned because of these men, and it consumed them in the process. Their suffering was not an accident. It was a feature. They absorbed trauma, so others did not have to. They were forced to see so the perpetrators could look away. As the months passed, executions of the labor prisoners became more frequent. Men were taken aside and shot, replaced without explanation. Entire groups disappeared overnight. New faces appeared the next day. The message was clear. No one was permanent. This cycle of use and disposal was as methodical as the killing itself. Human beings were treated as tools with limited lifespan. When worn down, they were discarded. For the outside world, none of this was visible. The forest hid the fires. The village learned not to notice smoke. Reports reduced everything to numbers. Chelmno remained a place without survivors, without testimony, without names. That was the intention. But the system carried within it a flaw. Knowledge, once acquired, could not be fully contained. Even here, under constant guard, the truth found cracks. Some prisoners began to plan, not because they believed escape was likely, but because remaining meant certain death. They observed routines, counted guards, noted moments of carelessness. Hope was not optimism. It was desperation sharpened into action. The guards underestimated them. They saw broken men, ghosts already halfway dead. They did not see what prolonged exposure to death can do to the human will when there is nothing left to lose. As Chelmno continued to operate, as transports arrived and the forest burned, something else was quietly forming among the labor prisoners. Not a rebellion yet, not a plan fully shaped, but an understanding that if anyone was ever going to speak of what happened here, it would have to be them. Because once their work was finished, Chelmno would try to erase them too. And the system, confident in its efficiency, did not yet realize that the men it forced to carry its secrets were also the only ones capable of exposing them. By the time the order came, the forest could no longer hide what it had been forced to absorb. The ground itself had begun to rebel. Graves shifted and sagged as gases built beneath the soil. In warm weather, the earth breathed out a smell that no amount of silence could explain away. Animals disturbed shallow pits. Ash clung to leaves long after fires burned out. Even the most disciplined system could not fully control nature, and nature was beginning to expose what Chelmno was meant to conceal. The decision to destroy the evidence did not come from a place of doubt or remorse. It came from fear. Fear of discovery. Fear that the killing, so carefully hidden, might become visible to the wrong eyes. The war was expanding. Front lines shifted. The possibility that enemies might one day reach this region could no longer be dismissed. The dead had to disappear completely. This was not the first time the Nazi regime had confronted this problem. Mass graves in the East had already begun to haunt those who ordered them dug. Reports circulated of villagers discovering burial sites, of smells carrying for kilometers, of bones surfacing after rain. The lesson was clear. Killing without erasure was incomplete. At Chelmno, erasure became the next phase of the system. The same prisoners who had buried the bodies were now ordered to exhume them. The work began at dawn and stretched until exhaustion made movement mechanical. Shovels struck soil that no longer felt like earth. It was slick, heavy, clotted with decay. Each movement released waves of stench that burned the lungs and eyes. Men gagged, vomited, then were forced to continue. Bodies emerged in stages of decomposition that defied recognition. Skin sloughed away. Limbs separated from torsos. Faces collapsed into something barely human. Clothing fused to flesh. Hair came away in clumps. The prisoners learned not to look for individuality. To see a face was to invite madness. Guards stood nearby with rifles, their expressions detached, impatient. This work was unpleasant, but it was necessary. Orders had been given. Schedules set. The dead were now an obstacle to be cleared. The prisoners were instructed how to build the pyres. Railroad tracks were laid across concrete supports or stacked logs, creating makeshift grills. What was piled beneath? Bodies were layered on top, arranged to maximize airflow. This was not improvised cruelty. It was method refined through trial and error. Human fat, they discovered, burned efficiently once ignited, sustaining the fire long after external fuel was consumed. When the pyres were lit, the forest changed forever. Flames roared day and night, their glow visible through the trees. Smoke rose in thick columns, carrying ash and the unmistakable odor of burning flesh. It clung to everything: clothing, hair, skin. The smell settled into the lungs and stayed there. Even when fires died down, it lingered, a reminder that nothing here was natural anymore. The prisoners worked beside the flames, feeding them continuously. Bodies were added as others collapsed into ash. Bones cracked loudly as heat split them apart. Occasionally, a skull would burst with a sharp sound that made men flinch despite themselves. There was no pause, no moment of quiet reflection. The work continued until orders were fulfilled. Ash was shoveled into pits or scattered. Larger bone fragments were crushed with tools or ground underfoot. Every effort was made to ensure nothing recognizable remained. Identity was the enemy now. Memory was the threat. The psychological toll on the prisoners was absolute. They were forced not only to witness death, but to dismantle it, to reduce entire lives to residue. Survivors would later struggle to describe the sensation, caught between horror and numbness, guilt and rage, despair and the raw instinct to remain alive for one more day. For the guards, this phase was different as well. Burning bodies produced evidence that could not be fully contained. Smoke drifted beyond the forest. Villagers noticed. Questions circulated quietly. Explanations were offered. Disease control, sanitation, wartime necessity. The lies were thinner now, stretched by visibility. Still, fear kept most people silent. Occupation had taught them that asking the wrong question could cost everything. It was safer not to know, safer not to look too closely. The destruction of evidence did not interrupt the killing. It ran parallel to it. While some prisoners burned bodies, others continued unloading new ones. The system did not pause to clean up its past before creating more of it. Death flowed forward, even as it was erased behind. This overlap increased pressure on everyone involved. Time became critical. Fires had to burn faster. Pits had to be cleared quickly. Efficiency reports tracked not only the number killed, but the number destroyed. The language of bureaucracy adapted seamlessly to this new task. The dead were no longer victims. They were material. As the months passed, Chelmno became a site not just of murder, but of systematic disappearance. People were killed, burned, and scattered without trace. Families searching for loved ones found nothing. No graves, no records, no confirmations. Absence became permanent. This absence served a purpose beyond secrecy. It stripped the victims of even posthumous recognition. Without bodies, there could be no funerals, no rituals, no markers of loss. Grief was suspended in uncertainty, leaving wounds that could not heal because they could not be named. The prisoners understood this too. They knew that if the dead vanished completely, then so would any chance of the world believing what had happened here. This knowledge sharpened their resolve. If they could not save lives, perhaps they could save truth. Small acts of defiance continued. Pieces of bone hidden instead of crushed. Ash scattered unevenly. Details memorized. Names whispered at night, so they would not be forgotten. These acts did nothing to stop the killing, but they preserved fragments of humanity in a place designed to erase it. The guards responded with increased brutality. Beatings became more frequent. Executions more arbitrary. The prisoners were reminded constantly that their survival depended on obedience, and even obedience offered no guarantees. As evidence disappeared, Chelmno grew more confident in its invisibility. The absence of discovery reinforced the belief that this method worked. That killing could be followed by erasure, so complete it left no echo. This belief would travel far beyond this forest. But erasure required constant effort. Fire had to be fed. Ash had to be managed. Labor had to be replaced as bodies and minds broke down. The system consumed resources even as it tried to eliminate all trace of its own existence. By late 1942 and into 1943, the pace began to shift. Transport slowed. Ghettos emptied. The immediate need that had driven Chelmno's operation appeared to be reaching a temporary conclusion. But the work of destruction continued, fueled by paranoia that something had been missed. The forest was searched repeatedly. Old pits reopened. Remains reburned. Nothing was left to chance. The goal was absolute disappearance. For the prisoners, this phase felt like the closing of a grave from the inside. They sensed that once the evidence was gone, their own usefulness would end. The system that had relied on their forced labor would no longer need witnesses. And so, alongside the fires, fear deepened. They watched guards whisper among themselves. They noticed changes in routine. Fewer transports. More executions of prisoners. Men taken away and not replaced. The future narrowed rapidly. Chelmno had reached a point where the past was being consumed faster than the present. Killing had become almost secondary to concealment. The system was folding inward, trying to erase its own tracks before moving on. What remained in the forest after the fires died down looked deceptively peaceful. Blackened earth, scattered ash, trees standing quietly, as they always had. To an untrained eye, nothing seemed out of place. But beneath the surface, the land had been permanently altered, saturated with death, imprinted with a history it was never meant to carry. The destruction of evidence did not mean the end of Chelmno. It meant preparation for its next phase, one shaped by retreat, by return, by repetition. A cycle that would close and then reopen when circumstances demanded it. The fires died down. The smoke thinned. Silence returned to the forest. And in that silence, the system prepared to decide who would be allowed to live long enough to remember what had been done here, and who would be erased along with the rest. They were not brought here in columns the way others were. There were no packed ghettos emptied street by street, no frantic rumors spreading ahead of them. Their disappearance was quieter, almost administrative, folded into paperwork that described them as patients, as families to be relocated, as people already half erased by the language used to describe them. By the time they arrived at Chelmno, much of the world had already been taught not to see them clearly at all. Long before the gas vans rolled through this forest, the Nazi state had been deciding who was allowed to live a life worth protecting. Disability, illness, and difference had been marked as threats to the imagined future of the Reich. People who could not work, who required care, who did not fit the rigid vision of strength and productivity, were labeled burdens. Their value is calculated not in humanity, but in cost. Across German-controlled Europe, institutions quietly emptied. Hospitals, care homes, psychiatric facilities. Patients were transferred under the promise of better treatment, of specialized care, of modern facilities. Families received letters written in calm, reassuring language. Some were told their loved ones had been moved. Others were told they had died suddenly of natural causes. Most never saw a body. This logic did not stop at borders. In the Warthegau, disabled Jews and non-Jews alike were among the first marked for removal. They were inconvenient to feed, inconvenient to move, inconvenient to exploit for labor. Chelmno offered a solution that required no explanation to the public and no visible violence. Trucks arrived. Patients were loaded. Engines ran. Paperwork closed the case. Many of those killed here had already lived lives shaped by dependency. Some could not walk without assistance. Some could not speak. Some did not fully understand where they were or why they were being moved. That vulnerability made them easier to control, but it also stripped the process of even the thin illusion of resistance the perpetrators sometimes claimed to fear. There were no riots when these transports arrived. No mass panic. Just confusion. Nurses and attendants were sometimes ordered to help escort patients, believing they were participating in a transfer, not an execution. They handed over people they had cared for, watched trucks pull away, and never saw them again. At Chelmno, the system made no distinction. The gas did not discriminate. Disability did not slow death. The killing process absorbed these victims as efficiently as any other, and because their disappearance caused fewer immediate ripples, it reinforced the belief that this method was ideal. The Roma followed soon after. They had already been hunted, displaced, and marginalized long before the war. In Nazi ideology, they occupied a contradictory position, sometimes labeled racially inferior, sometimes criminal, sometimes simply unwanted. What mattered in the end was that they were not considered part of the future the regime imagined. Roma families were rounded up from across the region. Unlike Jewish transports, which were often framed as labor relocation, Roma were treated as inherently suspect. Their movements were restricted, their camps monitored, their lives categorized as problems waiting to be solved. When they were sent to Chelmno, entire families arrived together, parents holding children, elders leaning on canes, wagons and carts confiscated, livelihoods erased in a single order. For many, this was not the first forced relocation they had endured. They had learned to expect hostility. What they had not learned was how complete the danger now was. The lies told to Roma families varied. Some were told they were being resettled. Others were told they were being processed for labor. Some were told nothing at all. The lack of explanation itself communicated power. Questions were pointless. Resistance was punished immediately. Inside the manor house, Roma victims were processed like everyone else. Clothing removed. Belongings seized. Families separated under the pretense of organization. Children clung to parents until guards intervened. Screams echoed briefly, then were silenced. The gas vans made no accommodation for age or illness. Children suffocated alongside adults. Infants died in arms that could not protect them. The forest received them all. For the Jewish prisoners forced to handle the bodies, these transports carried a particular weight. Seeing entire families, children still wrapped in blankets, people who had never been part of the ghettos they themselves came from, reinforced the understanding that no one was outside the system's reach. There was no hierarchy of survival, only timing. The killing of the disabled and the Roma revealed something essential about Chelmno. This was not merely a site for exterminating a single group. It was a tool, a flexible instrument that could be applied to anyone deemed unnecessary. This flexibility made it valuable. Reports sent upward framed these operations as successes. Fewer complications, less resistance, efficient throughput. The absence of public disturbance was noted approvingly. The victims' identities were irrelevant. What mattered was that the method worked. Families left behind searched for answers. Parents asked institutions where their children had been moved. Spouses requested death certificates. Replies, when they came at all, were vague. Illness, heart failure, natural causes. The bureaucracy of death smoothed over the brutality beneath it. For Roma communities, disappearance was often total. Entire extended families vanished within days. Camps were emptied. Paths went quiet. The loss was immediate and communal, but documentation was scarce. Without records, grief became diffuse, passed down in memory rather than inscribed in files. This lack of documentation was not an oversight. It was part of the design. The Nazis understood that some deaths provoked outrage, while others slipped through gaps already carved by prejudice. Disabled people and Roma had long been marginalized. Their absence raised fewer alarms. Their deaths generated less scrutiny. Chelmno exploited that reality mercilessly. Inside the camp's operations, these killings did not disrupt routine. They fit seamlessly into the existing process. Intake, undressing, trucks, forest, return. The machine did not pause to reflect on who was being fed into it. Identity had already been stripped away by the time the door closed. Yet these victims altered the atmosphere in subtle ways. Children's toys appeared among confiscated belongings, mobility aids, medical equipment, items that spoke of care rather than commerce. The Jewish prisoners sorting possessions noticed these differences. They recognized the signs of lives shaped by illness, by dependency, by community rather than ghetto confinement. These details made denial harder. The guards noticed too, though many refused to acknowledge it. Killing adults could be framed as policy. Killing children, the disabled, entire Roma families stripped away even the thinnest ideological justification. It exposed the core truth. This was not about security or war. It was about elimination. Some perpetrators compensated by leaning harder into routine, by refusing to slow down, by treating these transports as no different from any other. Speed became a shield against conscience. For the system, these killings served another function. They tested how far the process could stretch without breaking. They proved that Chelmno could absorb diverse groups without logistical adjustment, that it could function as a universal endpoint. This realization mattered, because as the war continued, the list of those deemed expendable would grow, and Chelmno had already shown that it could accommodate them. The killing of the disabled and the Roma also deepened the prisoners' understanding of their own fate. If children and patients were not spared, then no category offered protection. Survival depended not on innocence or usefulness, but on temporary utility. That knowledge sharpened resolve among some and crushed it in others. For a few, it confirmed that escape, however unlikely, was the only path that offered even a theoretical future. As these transports continued, Chelmno's role evolved. It was no longer just solving a regional problem. It was demonstrating a principle, that murder could be targeted, quiet, adaptable, and deniable, applied wherever the regime decided life had no value. And because this principle worked, it would not remain confined to this forest. As the killing of the disabled and the Roma faded into the same ash and silence as the rest, Chelmno stood as proof that entire categories of people could be erased without leaving a mark on the public conscience. But even as this phase reached its peak, changes were already coming. The ghettos were thinning. The region was being declared increasingly cleansed. Attention was shifting elsewhere. Chelmno's work, it seemed, might soon be finished. That belief would prove temporary. Because once a system like this exists, once it has proven its usefulness, it is never truly dismantled. It is only paused, waiting for the next moment when the world decides some lives are once again inconvenient enough to disappear. The end did not arrive with an announcement. There were no speeches, no declarations that the work here was finished. It came instead through subtle absences. Fewer transports, longer gaps between arrivals, guards standing idle longer than before, unsure what to do with the silence. The machine that had consumed so many lives began to slow, not because of mercy, but because the immediate demand for its output had diminished. By the spring of 1943, the ghettos that had fed Chelmno were largely empty. Kolo was gone. Nearby Jewish communities had been erased or transferred elsewhere. The region was being described in reports as increasingly cleansed, its problems solved. To the administrators who measured success in numbers removed, this was victory. At Chelmno, the killing did not stop immediately. It tapered. The last transports were processed with the same procedures as the first, the same lies, the same trucks, the same forest. But there was a growing sense that something was ending. The guards felt it. The prisoners felt it most of all. The forest detail was ordered to intensify destruction efforts. Old burial sites were reopened again, even those already burned once. Ash was sifted. Bone fragments were crushed repeatedly. The goal was no longer simply concealment. It was obliteration. The past had to disappear completely before the site could be abandoned. Buildings were dismantled piece by piece. The manor house was stripped of anything that could identify its function. Fixtures removed. Rooms altered. Traces erased. What could not be removed was destroyed. What could not be destroyed was buried. The Jewish prisoners understood what this meant. A system that no longer needed evidence would no longer need witnesses. As transports ended, executions of prisoners increased. Men were taken aside and shot under the pretense of transfer or punishment. Entire groups disappeared overnight. New replacements were not brought in. The labor pool was being closed. Fear sharpened into certainty. Some prisoners attempted escape during this period, driven by desperation rather than planning. Most failed. The surrounding countryside was hostile, patrolled, unforgiving. Captured escapees were executed publicly as warnings. Their deaths were meant to extinguish hope in those who remained. By April, Chelmno was effectively shut down. The remaining prisoners were murdered. Guards were reassigned. Equipment was removed or destroyed. The trucks were sent elsewhere. The forest fell quiet. Smoke stopped rising. The roads returned to their ordinary wartime traffic. To an outsider, it would have looked as though nothing extraordinary had ever happened here. The village remained. Fields were plowed again. The river flowed. Birds returned to the forest edges. Nature reclaimed the spaces where death had been forced into the soil. Chelmno faded from the daily concerns of the occupation authorities, replaced by new priorities, new fronts, new problems. But history did not release it. Far to the east, the war began to turn. German forces stalled, then retreated. The illusion of permanence cracked. As territories were lost, attention shifted from expansion to containment. And with that shift came an unsettling realization for Nazi planners. The Jewish population that had been deliberately preserved in the Lodz ghetto was still alive. Lodz had been spared not out of mercy, but utility. Its factories supplied the German war effort. Its workforce was exploited relentlessly. But by 1944, even that calculation began to change. The Red Army was advancing. The ghetto, once deep inside German-held territory, now sat uncomfortably close to the front. The question resurfaced, urgent and familiar. What to do with the remaining Jews? The large extermination camps farther east were no longer reliable options. Some had been dismantled. Others lay too close to advancing Soviet forces. Rail lines were disrupted. Time was short. And so, the past returned. Chelmno, thought finished, was reconsidered. Its location, once ideal for secrecy, now offered something else: proximity. The Lodz ghetto was nearby. The road still existed. The forest still stood. And most importantly, the site had already been erased once. It could be reactivated quickly. In the early summer of 1944, orders were given to rebuild what had been dismantled. Not fully, not openly, just enough to function. New personnel arrived. Some had served there before. Others were new to the site, but familiar with the methods. The manor house was not reused this time. Too exposed. Instead, operations shifted more directly to the forest area. The killing process adapted to circumstances, shedding any unnecessary steps. The Jewish prisoners forced into labor during this second phase were drawn from the Lodz ghetto itself. They arrived weakened by years of starvation, disease, and terror. Many did not survive long enough to understand where they were. This time, the lies were thinner. There was less time to construct elaborate deceptions. Transports were rushed. Panic spread more quickly. People had heard rumors by now. They had seen too much to fully believe in resettlement. Resistance flickered, but rarely ignited. Exhaustion had done its work. The gas vans returned. They had not been abandoned. They had been preserved for moments like this. Engines roared once again along the same roads. Doors closed. The forest absorbed another wave of death. But something had changed. The world beyond Chelmno was no longer static. The sound of distant artillery, sometimes carried on the wind. German officials spoke in sharper tones. Anxiety crept into routines that had once felt permanent. The sense of control that had defined the earlier phase was eroding. The prisoners sensed it too. Guards were more volatile. Punishments harsher. Orders contradictory. The system still killed, but it no longer felt confident. It felt rushed. The killing of the Lodz ghetto Jews continued through the summer. Thousands were murdered in a place the Nazis had already tried to erase. The repetition was grotesque, as if history itself were being forced to loop, replaying the same crime because the perpetrators could not imagine an alternative. By September, the pace slowed again. The Red Army drew closer. Chelmno was no longer safe. The same paranoia that had driven evidence destruction now returned with greater urgency. Once again, the order came to erase everything. Remaining prisoners were executed. Buildings destroyed. Equipment removed or abandoned. Fires burned what could still burn. Ash was scattered. Bones crushed. The forest was forced to swallow its secrets a second time. This time, there would be no third reopening. In January of 1945, Soviet forces entered the region. They found a village, a forest, scattered signs of disturbance. No camp, no gas chambers, no obvious machinery of death. Chelmno had been designed to vanish, and in many ways, it succeeded. What remained were fragments, survivor testimonies, scattered documents, the memories of villagers who had learned not to speak. The land itself, altered in ways that could not be fully explained. Chelmno did not fit the post-war image of a death camp. It had no iconic structures, no dramatic ruins. It had been quiet, mobile, deniable. And because of that, it was harder to understand, harder to remember, easier to overlook. But its significance was immense. It was here that killing by gas was first used continuously. Here that murder was fully integrated into administrative routine. Here that the logic of extermination was tested, refined, and proven. The shutdown and reopening of Chelmno revealed something fundamental about the system that created it. These were not crimes of chaos. They were crimes of planning. And as long as planning existed, places like Chelmno could be dismantled and rebuilt as needed. The camp did not end because the ideology behind it collapsed. It ended because the war made its operation impossible. And when the war ended, Chelmno slipped into a shadow between history and memory, a place that had done its work too efficiently, too quietly, leaving behind not ruins, but absence. That absence would shape how long it took the world to fully understand what had happened here, and how easily such a place could be forgotten, even as it stood at the beginning of one of history's darkest paths. By the time the last phase began, there were no illusions left to maintain. The world that had once allowed lies to function had collapsed inward on itself. Rumors were no longer whispers. They were facts spoken softly because speaking loudly no longer mattered. In the Lodz ghetto, people understood that survival had narrowed to days, perhaps hours, and that whatever waited beyond the gates would not be work, would not be relocation, would not be a future that resembled life. Years of starvation had already done what violence alone could not. Bodies were thinned to the point of fragility. Faces hollowed. Movements slow and deliberate, not from discipline, but from exhaustion. The ghetto had been preserved longer than any other, not because it was safe, but because it was useful. Now even that usefulness had expired. Orders came down without ceremony. The remaining population was to be removed. The Red Army was approaching. Time was short. The question of where to send tens of thousands of people no longer had many answers left. Chelmno returned as a solution not because it was ideal, but because it was available. This time, there was no manor house waiting to receive people with polite lies and procedural calm. The killing center had been stripped to its most basic function: intake, death, disposal. Everything else was excess. The forest became the focal point. The gas vans returned to the roads they already knew too well. Transports began moving out of the Lodz ghetto in the summer of 1944. People were told they were being transferred for labor, though few believed it. They were told to bring minimal belongings. Many brought nothing at all. What use was luggage when the future felt like a rumor no one trusted anymore? Families were torn apart in haste. Children clung to parents. Elderly people struggled to keep pace. Guards shouted now, not to intimidate, but to hurry. The tone had changed. The calm efficiency of earlier phases was gone. Urgency replaced order. The journey to Chelmno was still short, but it no longer carried reassurance. The closeness of the destination now felt ominous. People recognized the landscape. They knew where they were. Some had heard stories. Some had seen smoke months earlier. Denial was no longer possible. When they arrived, there was no pretense of bathing or registration. The system had shed its earlier layers of deception. People were driven directly toward the forest area. Trucks waited openly. Engines running. Doors ready. Panic spread quickly. Screams broke through the air. Some resisted. Some tried to flee. Most could not. Years of confinement and hunger had drained bodies of the strength required for resistance. Guards responded with violence now, openly, without concern for efficiency or appearances. Time mattered more than order. The gas vans filled rapidly. This phase of killing was less controlled, more brutal in its urgency. Procedures still existed, but they were rushed. The goal was speed. As many as possible, as quickly as possible, before the front reached the area. Inside the vans, death came the same way it always had. Exhaust filled sealed compartments. Dizziness. Collapse. Silence. The difference now was scale and desperation. There were more people than the system could comfortably handle. Schedules stretched. Drivers worked without rest. The forest burned constantly to keep up. The Jewish prisoners forced to work this phase were drawn directly from the Lodz ghetto. Many arrived already sick, already near death. They were given no time to adjust, no false hope of survival. They understood immediately what was happening and what their role meant. Their labor was brutal and brief. Bodies arrived faster than before. Fires burned hotter, longer. Ash accumulated quickly. Bone fragments were crushed without care. The pace left no room for reflection, even if reflection had been possible. For the prisoners, fear now had a different quality. Earlier, survival had felt fragile but conceivable. Now it felt impossible. The system was clearly winding down, and they knew what that meant. Witnesses would not be allowed to remain. Executions increased. Men were taken away under the pretense of reassignment and shot. Others were killed arbitrarily to maintain terror. Replacement prisoners arrived less frequently. The labor pool was shrinking deliberately. In the transports themselves, there were moments of raw clarity. Parents whispered final words to children. Strangers held hands. Some sang quietly. Others prayed. Some sat in silence, conserving what little dignity remained. The knowledge of death did not always produce chaos. Sometimes it produced stillness. The forest absorbed these final transports with a grim familiarity. It had done this before. It knew the rhythm. The soil had been turned and burned so many times it no longer resisted. The guards, too, were different now. Anxiety crept into their movements. Conversations were tense. Orders contradicted one another. The certainty that had once defined Chelmno was gone. Killing continued, but confidence had cracked. Distant artillery could sometimes be heard. Not always clearly, but enough to remind everyone that the war was moving closer, that the world beyond the forest was changing. This proximity intensified everything. The prisoners worked faster, driven by fear and the faint hope that chaos might create an opening. The guards grew harsher, desperate to finish what they had been ordered to do before retreat became inevitable. Some transports were interrupted. Schedules shifted unexpectedly. People waited longer than expected, standing in open areas, watching smoke rise, realizing with horrifying clarity what awaited them. In these moments, resistance flared. A few tried to run. Shots rang out. Bodies fell. Others watched, paralyzed, understanding that escape for one meant death for many. Collective punishment loomed over every decision. The gas vans continued to operate until the last possible moment. When fuel ran low, engines were conserved carefully. Nothing was wasted. Not time, not resources, not lives. As summer turned toward autumn, the killing slowed, not because the desire ended, but because the system could no longer sustain itself under the pressure of advancing enemy forces. Chelmno was becoming a liability. The final transports from the Lodz ghetto marked the end of an era. This was the last major Jewish community in the region. Its destruction carried symbolic weight, even if the perpetrators never acknowledged it openly. The ghetto that had been held up as a model of exploitation was now reduced to ash. Those who died in this final phase were among the last Jewish victims murdered on occupied Polish soil before liberation. They were killed not in the early frenzy of genocide, but in its exhausted, panicked aftermath, when the perpetrators knew the end was approaching and acted anyway. The forest bore witness to this final cruelty without distinction. It did not know early or late, ideology or desperation. It received the dead as it always had. As the killing wound down, attention shifted once again to erasure. Evidence had to be destroyed quickly. Fires burned intensely. Ash was scattered hastily. Buildings were dismantled. Equipment was removed or abandoned. The remaining prisoners understood that time had run out. They watched guards pack belongings. They noticed preparations for retreat. They saw fewer replacements arriving. The meaning was unmistakable. For some, this realization extinguished hope completely. For others, it ignited something else. If death was certain, then fear lost its power. Whispers spread among the remaining labor prisoners. Observations were shared quietly. Guard routines, moments of inattention, weak points. The chaos of retreat created cracks in the system that had once felt impenetrable. The killing of the final transports did not bring closure. It brought a narrowing of possibilities. The world was changing rapidly now, and Chelmno, which had once operated in near total secrecy, found itself running out of time. The machines that had worked so efficiently in silence were now racing against history itself. And in that race, something unexpected began to take shape among those who had been forced to carry the system's darkest secrets. Not resignation, not acceptance, but the dangerous, fragile beginning of resistance. It began not with courage, but with exhaustion, the kind that strips fear of its edge. When the body has already accepted that it will not survive, the mind becomes strangely clear. For the prisoners still alive at Chelmno, this clarity arrived slowly, sharpened by weeks of watching men disappear, by the certainty that the system was closing in on itself, and that witnesses were being erased as methodically as evidence. They knew the pattern now. When the killings slowed, executions increased. When replacements stopped arriving, death followed soon after. Chelmno did not preserve laborers. It consumed them. And as the last transports from Lodz were swallowed by the forest, the remaining prisoners understood that their own time had been calculated down to days, perhaps hours. In that narrowing space, silence changed character. It was no longer only fear. It was preparation. They began to watch differently. Guards who had once seemed omnipresent now appeared distracted, tense, irritable. Orders contradicted one another. Routines shifted without warning. The discipline that had defined the earlier phases was breaking down under the weight of retreat. Men who had once moved with procedural confidence now argued, drank more heavily, lashed out unpredictably. The prisoners noticed all of it. They counted footsteps. They memorized the timing of patrols. They noted which guards lingered, which rushed, which looked away. They learned the sound of keys, the clink of metal against belt buckles, the subtle difference between a guard alert and a guard board. None of this felt like hope. It felt like necessity. They did not speak openly. Words were dangerous. Instead, they exchanged glances, brief gestures, fragments of understanding passed without language. In a place where speaking the truth could get you killed, silence became the medium of planning. Some had survived earlier purges by chance, others by being momentarily useful. None believed they would be spared again. The knowledge bound them together more tightly than ideology ever could. Survival, if it came at all, would come through action. The plan, such as it was, did not promise escape for many. It promised disruption, chaos, a chance, however small, that someone might get beyond the forest before the guards regained control. That was enough. They gathered what they could. Tools used for labor became weapons by necessity. Hammers, knives, shovels, anything that could strike, cut, or distract. There were no firearms. There was no ammunition. This would not be a battle. It would be a rupture. The moment came abruptly, triggered not by perfect conditions, but by urgency. A group of prisoners was being moved under guard. The implication clear that another execution was imminent. Waiting any longer meant dying without resistance. When the first blow landed, it was almost clumsy. A guard fell, surprised more than wounded. Shouts erupted. Gunfire followed immediately. Panic spread through the forest, not among victims, but among perpetrators who had grown accustomed to control. The prisoners surged forward, some attacking, some running, some frozen by shock. Bullets tore through the air. Men fell. Others kept moving, driven by something beyond calculation. Adrenaline drowned out fear. The forest, which had hidden so much death, now offered cover. Branches tore clothing. Mud swallowed boots. The ground, churned by years of burial and burning, was uneven and treacherous. Some tripped and were shot where they fell. Others vanished into the trees, their direction uncertain, their fate unknown. The guards fired wildly at first, then more deliberately. Whistles blew. Orders were shouted. Dogs were released. The system, wounded but not dead, reacted as it had been trained to do. Most of the escapees were caught quickly. The surrounding countryside was hostile terrain. Locals were afraid. Patrols moved swiftly. Captured prisoners were beaten, interrogated, executed. Their deaths were meant to restore order, to reassert the illusion of control. But not all were caught. A handful slipped through gaps created by chaos and luck. They crawled through undergrowth, hid in ditches, submerged themselves in cold water to mask scent. They moved at night and lay still during the day. Hunger gnawed at them. Fear followed them like a shadow. But they were alive. Those who remained behind faced immediate retaliation. The guards needed an example. They needed to prove that resistance only led to suffering. Prisoners were lined up. Executions were carried out in front of the others. The message was delivered brutally and clearly. Yet something had shifted irreversibly. The escape had broken the most important illusion Chelmno relied upon, that no one would ever leave to tell what had happened here. Even the guards understood this. though they would never admit it. Panic crept into their actions. The urgency to erase everything intensified. Orders came to execute the remaining prisoners as quickly as possible. No more delays. No more labor beyond what was strictly necessary. Those who had not escaped were murdered in groups. Some were shot. Others were killed in ways that left less evidence. The system no longer cared about efficiency or psychological distance. It cared about silence. As the last witnesses were eliminated, the forest returned to stillness. The fires burned one final time. Ash was scattered hurriedly. Equipment was destroyed or abandoned. Buildings were reduced to ruins. Chelmno prepared for its final disappearance. But outside the forest, the escapees were moving through a different world. They encountered fear first. Farmers who refused to help. Villagers who shut doors. Some threatened to report them. Others simply turned away. Occupation had taught people to prioritize survival above all else, and helping an escaped prisoner was dangerous. Yet there were moments of humanity. A loaf of bread, left quietly by a fence. A direction whispered and quickly retracted. A barn where someone pretended not to notice a figure hiding in the shadows. These acts did not come from courage as much as recognition, a shared understanding of what was happening, even if it could not be spoken aloud. The escapees learned to avoid roads, to trust the forest more than people. They moved slowly, conserving strength, knowing that capture meant death, not just for them, but potentially for those who helped them. Some did not survive long. Hunger, exposure, and patrols claimed them, but a few endured. They crossed front lines. They reached partisan units. They encountered advancing Soviet forces. When they spoke, at first, they were not believed. Their stories sounded impossible. Trucks that killed. A camp with no barracks. A forest that burned bodies to ash. No gas chambers. No rail platforms. No towering chimneys. Chelmno did not fit the image people had begun to form of extermination camps. Skepticism was understandable. The truth often is. But they persisted. They described the manor house, the road, the trucks, the forest pits, the fires, the labor, the erasure. Their accounts overlapped in detail despite being told separately. The consistency mattered. Slowly, the outline of Chelmno emerged from their words. For the Nazis, the escape was a failure of containment. But it came too late to alter the outcome of the war. The system that had relied on secrecy was collapsing everywhere. Camps were being liberated. Documents captured. Testimonies collected. Chelmno's difference would make it harder to grasp, but not impossible. When Soviet forces entered the area in January of 1945, they found little. A village, a forest, scattered ruins. No intact machinery of death. No piles of bodies. The place had done its work too quietly. Investigators dug into the soil. They found ash, bone fragments, charred remains, enough to confirm that something extraordinary had happened here, even if much had been erased. The escapees' testimonies became crucial. Without them, Chelmno might have remained a rumor, a footnote, a place without shape. Their survival gave form to absence. They spoke not only of how people died, but of how the system worked, of routines, of methods, of the deliberate separation between killing and seeing, of the way ordinary men became parts of a machine without ever fully confronting what they were doing. These details mattered. They revealed Chelmno not as an anomaly, but as a prototype, a place where mass murder was tested, refined, and proven workable. For those who escaped, survival came with its own burden. They carried memories no one should have to carry. Guilt for those left behind. Rage at the world's slowness to understand. The constant awareness that telling the truth did not bring the dead back. Yet they told it anyway. Because Chelmno had been designed to leave no survivors. No witnesses. No memory. And the fact that anyone escaped at all was a rupture the system could not repair. The forest had tried to swallow everything. Fire had tried to erase names. Bureaucracy had tried to reduce lives to numbers and ash. But the truth had slipped through. And as the war ended and the world began to reckon with what it had allowed to happen, Chelmno's story emerged not through ruins or monuments, but through voices that refused to be silenced. Voices that carried the weight of a place built to vanish. Voices that would force history to remember what Chelmno tried so hard to erase. And with those voices now reaching beyond the forest, the final chapter was no longer about killing or concealment. It was about what remains when a crime built on secrecy is finally exposed to the light. After the gunfire faded and the last fires burned themselves down to embers, Chelmno did not announce its end. It simply receded, slipping back into the landscape as if it had never existed at all. That, more than anything else, was the camp's final act. Not destruction. Disappearance. When Soviet troops entered the area in January of 1945, they did not encounter a camp in the way the word had begun to be understood elsewhere. There were no intact barracks lined with prisoners, no rail platforms choked with belongings, no chimneys still warm from use. What they found instead was absence, and absence is harder to recognize as evidence. The village stood largely intact. Houses remained occupied. Fields lay dormant under winter frost. The forest was quiet, its trees bare, its paths indistinct. To an untrained eye, nothing suggested that this place had functioned as a factory of death. Chelmno had been designed for exactly this outcome. Investigators walked the grounds carefully, uncertain where to look. The manor house was gone, reduced to fragments and foundations. Outbuildings had been dismantled, equipment removed or destroyed. Trucks that once carried death had vanished with retreating forces. If this had been the only evidence available, Chelmno might have been dismissed as rumor. But the ground told a different story. When they began to dig, they found layers of ash mixed into the soil, unnatural in concentration. Bone fragments appeared, charred and crushed. Teeth, pieces too small to identify individually, but unmistakable in aggregate. The forest, stripped of its surface calm, revealed what it had been forced to hold. Even then, understanding came slowly. The investigators were encountering something that did not fit existing categories. This was not a labor camp abandoned in haste. It was not a conventional extermination camp with permanent killing installations. Chelmno had operated through mobility, improvisation, and erasure. Its machinery was not architectural. It was procedural. To make sense of it, they needed witnesses. This was where the survivors mattered. The men who had escaped months earlier, emaciated and traumatized, began to speak to Soviet officials, to Polish investigators, to anyone willing to listen. Their accounts filled in the gaps that the land alone could not explain. They described the gas vans, the sealed compartments, the engines running, the forest fires, the labor forced upon them, the executions of those who had seen too much. At first, these stories were met with confusion. Gas trucks were not yet widely known. The idea that a camp could function without permanent structures challenged assumptions. Skepticism was natural, even understandable, but the testimonies aligned. Different men, questioned separately, described the same routines, the same routes, the same methods, the same locations in the forest. Their stories overlapped, not in emotion alone, but in technical detail. That consistency mattered. Slowly, Chelmno began to emerge as something distinct. It was recognized as the first place where mass killing by gas had been carried out on a continuous basis. Earlier atrocities had relied on bullets, on chaos, on proximity. Chelmno represented a shift. Killing had been mechanized, routinized, and detached. It had been folded into daily administration. This realization carried profound implications. Chelmno was no longer just a crime scene. It was a prototype. Investigators traced connections outward. Personnel who had served here had gone on to other camps. Techniques tested here had been refined elsewhere. The logic of separation between killer and victim, between decision and death, appeared again and again across the extermination system. Chelmno's relative invisibility had allowed it to function as a laboratory. Its success had encouraged expansion. Its methods had informed later designs that would operate on even larger scales. And yet, despite this significance, Chelmno struggled to find its place in the emerging narrative of the Holocaust. There were reasons for this. Its victims left few traces. Entire communities vanished without graves or records. The lack of photographs and intact structures made it difficult to visualize. Post-war memory often gravitates toward what can be seen, and Chelmno had erased itself too thoroughly. Survivors, too, were few. Many had been murdered before liberation. Others were too traumatized to speak immediately. Some stories were delayed by years, even decades, weighed down by disbelief and the sheer difficulty of articulating what had happened. As trials began in the post-war period, Chelmno surfaced intermittently. Perpetrators were identified, interrogated, prosecuted. Some were convicted. Others evaded justice. The machinery of accountability, like the machinery of murder before it, was uneven. Testimony about Chelmno often sounded different from testimony about Auschwitz or Treblinka. There were no selections on platforms, no daily roll calls in striped uniforms. The killing was swift, concealed, and mobile. For some listeners, this made it harder to grasp, not easier. Yet this difference was precisely why Chelmno mattered. It demonstrated that genocide does not require monumental architecture or mass spectacle. It can operate quietly, using ordinary tools, under the cover of routine. It can be woven into everyday life so seamlessly that it disappears when the work is done. In the years that followed, Chelmno faded from public consciousness more quickly than other sites. Memorialization came late. Research developed slowly. Survivors aged. Documents scattered. The forest grew back thicker. But absence itself became part of the lesson. Historians who returned to Chelmno did not study ruins so much as systems. They reconstructed processes, mapped routes, compared testimonies. They treated the site not as a static place, but as an operation that moved through space and time. What emerged was a clearer understanding of how early the Nazi state had committed to total extermination and how methodically it pursued that goal. Chelmno was not an improvisation born of wartime desperation. It was a deliberate choice made when other options still existed. This realization challenged comforting myths. It challenged the idea that genocide escalated gradually, reluctantly. It showed that the will to kill on an industrial scale existed early, and that once a workable method was found, it was embraced. For Poland, Chelmno posed another challenge. The site sat within a living village. Memory and daily life overlapped uncomfortably. Commemoration required confronting not only German crimes, but the silences and fears that had surrounded them. Over time, memorials were established, markers placed, the forest paths named, education programs developed. Chelmno began to re-enter historical consciousness, not as a footnote, but as a foundational chapter. Yet even today, it remains less known than other camps. That obscurity is not accidental. Chelmno was designed to vanish. It succeeded so well that even remembrance has had to fight against the logic that created it. To remember Chelmno is to resist disappearance itself. It forces a confrontation with how easily systems can be built to kill quietly, how bureaucracy can mask atrocity, how absence can be mistaken for innocence. The post-war reckoning with Chelmno did not bring closure. There could be no closure for a place where most victims have no graves, no names, no surviving family members to mourn them publicly. What it did bring was responsibility. Responsibility to understand that genocide does not announce itself with fanfare. It begins in offices, in memos, in logistical discussions. It grows through routine. It survives through silence. Chelmno teaches that lesson with devastating clarity. As decades passed, survivors continued to speak, historians continued to research, and the forest continued to stand, carrying a history it never asked for. Each retelling pushed back against the erasure the perpetrators had worked so hard to achieve. And yet, the story still feels unfinished. Because remembering Chelmno is not only about acknowledging what happened here, it is about recognizing the conditions that made it possible and the ease with which such conditions can return under different names and justifications. The camp did not need walls to function. It needed compliance, fear, and the belief that some lives mattered less than others. Those beliefs did not die in the forest. They require constant challenge. As the world moved further away from the war, Chelmno remained a warning etched not in stone, but in process. A reminder that the most dangerous systems are often the ones that leave the least behind. And with that understanding settling into place, the final question lingered, unresolved and uncomfortable. Not how Chelmno ended, but how easily it began, how quietly it worked, and how close its logic remains to the surface of the modern world, waiting for conditions that might allow it to take shape again. The land does not speak, but it remembers. Long after documents fade and voices fall silent, the ground retains an imprint of what it was forced to hold. At Chelmno, that memory exists not as ruins rising from the earth, but as something harder to grasp. Absence. Gaps where names should be. Spaces where grief never received a body to mourn. For decades after the war, Chelmno remained an uneasy place. Not abandoned, not frozen in time, but lived in. Children played near paths that once led to mass graves. Farmers worked fields whose soil contained ash ground so fine it blended seamlessly into the earth. Life resumed, because life always does, even when history has not been reckoned with. This normalcy unsettled those who knew what had happened here. How could a place that consumed so many simply return to quiet existence? How could birds nest in trees that had once been darkened by smoke from burning bodies? The question itself revealed something uncomfortable. Evil does not always leave scars that are easy to see. In the years immediately following liberation, attention focused elsewhere. The scale of the Holocaust was overwhelming, and sites with surviving structures, with liberated prisoners, with photographic evidence, naturally drew the world's gaze. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka. These names became symbols. Chelmno, by contrast, had done its work too efficiently. There were no barracks to tour, no gas chambers to walk through, no mountains of shoes preserved behind glass. What remained were testimonies, fragments, forensic traces in soil, and a forest that looked deceptively ordinary. For many, this made Chelmno harder to understand, and therefore easier to forget. Survivors carried that burden. Those who escaped spoke again and again, often to audiences unsure how to receive their words. Their experiences did not match the mental image people had begun to form of extermination camps. Mobile gas vans sounded implausible. A camp without fences sounded incomplete. A place that vanished sounded exaggerated. And yet, the truth does not need to fit expectations to be real. Slowly, painstakingly, historians reconstructed what had happened here. They mapped transport routes, cross-referenced testimonies, examined soil samples, traced personnel movements. Chelmno emerged not as an outlier, but as a starting point. The first place where extermination by gas was carried out systematically and continuously. This realization altered the understanding of how the Holocaust unfolded. Chelmno demonstrated that genocide did not begin with monumental camps or industrial complexes. It began with decisions, with experimentation, with a willingness to test methods on human beings and refine them when they proved effective. It showed that once a killing method worked, moral barriers collapsed completely. The camp's history also revealed how easily mass murder could be hidden when it relied on mobility, secrecy, and bureaucratic language. Killing did not require screaming crowds or visible violence. It could be disguised as transport, as sanitation, as procedure. It could be carried out by men who went home at the end of the day, convinced they had simply done their jobs. This is perhaps Chelmno's most disturbing legacy. It forces a confrontation not only with what happened, but with how ordinary it was allowed to become. The perpetrators were not monsters in appearance. They were drivers, clerks, guards, supervisors. Men who operated within a system that rewarded obedience and punished reflection. Chelmno exposes how systems can hollow out responsibility until no one feels fully accountable, even as everyone is complicit. As memorialization efforts grew in the latter half of the 20th century, Chelmno slowly gained recognition. Markers were placed. Paths were designated. The forest was no longer just a forest. It became a cemetery without headstones, a space of mourning without names. Visitors today often describe a strange dissonance. There is no spectacle, no overwhelming architecture, just quiet, birds, wind moving through leaves. The knowledge of what happened here settles gradually, heavily, precisely because nothing obvious announces it. That quiet is not peaceful. It is confrontational. It asks the visitor to imagine what cannot be seen, to listen for what is no longer audible, to understand that the most dangerous atrocities may leave behind the least evidence. Education about Chelmno remains essential, not because it is unique in its cruelty, but because it is representative of something broader. It shows how genocide adapts to circumstances, how it evolves methods, how it learns from success. The gas vans that operated here were not the endpoint. They were a step. The lessons learned at Chelmno traveled elsewhere, informing larger extermination centers where killing would be scaled up even further. Chelmno did not exist in isolation. It was part of a continuum. Remembering it, therefore, is not an act of historical completeness alone. It is an act of vigilance, because the conditions that made Chelmno possible were not extraordinary. They were frighteningly common. Dehumanization, bureaucratic language, obedience to authority, the belief that some lives are expendable for the sake of efficiency, order, or ideology. These ideas did not vanish in 1945. They reappear whenever fear overrides empathy, whenever groups are reduced to problems, whenever killing is framed as necessity rather than choice. Chelmno teaches that genocide does not require hatred alone. It requires systems that turn hatred into routine. The victims of Chelmno remain largely nameless. Tens of thousands of lives ended without records, without graves, without families able to mark their passing. This anonymity was deliberate. It was part of the crime. To deny names is to deny memory. Restoring that memory is an ongoing task. Each testimony preserved, each historical study published, each visitor who walks the forest paths with knowledge rather than ignorance pushes back against the erasure that defined this place. Remembrance here is not passive. It is resistance. Chelmno asks difficult questions of the present. Would we recognize a place like this if it existed today, stripped of dramatic imagery, hidden behind administrative language? Would we believe witnesses whose stories did not fit our expectations? Would we notice when disappearance happens quietly, one group at a time? These questions do not accuse. They warn. The Holocaust is often remembered as an explosion of evil. Chelmno reminds us it was also a process, one that began with testing, refined itself through repetition, and relied on people doing what was expected of them without asking why. Standing at Chelmno now, there is no single structure to focus on, no clear boundary between where life ended and where it continued. That ambiguity is part of its truth. The camp was never meant to be seen. It was meant to function and then disappear. The fact that it nearly succeeded in that goal is precisely why its story must be told in full. Not to shock, not to overwhelm, but to understand. Because history does not repeat itself in identical forms. It repeats itself in patterns. Chelmno represents one of those patterns at its earliest and most distilled stage. A quiet place, a small village, a forest, trucks on a road, orders written in offices far away, lives reduced to numbers, evidence burned, witnesses silenced. And yet, despite all of that, something remained. Memory survived, through those who escaped, through those who investigated, through those who insisted that absence itself was evidence, through those who refused to let a place built to vanish succeed completely. The story of Chelmno does not end with liberation or trials or memorials. It continues every time someone learns its name for the first time, every time its methods are explained, every time its lessons are applied beyond the past. Because Chelmno is not only a place in history, It is a warning embedded in it, a reminder that the most devastating crimes can occur without spectacle, without noise, without ruins to photograph afterward. That evil often prefers efficiency to chaos, procedure to passion, silence to screams. And that remembering places like Chelmno is not about dwelling in darkness, but about sharpening awareness. So that when systems begin to reduce human beings to problems, when language hides violence behind neutrality, when disappearance is framed as necessity, we recognize the pattern before it completes itself. That is the final legacy of Chelmno. Not only that it happened, but that it happened quietly, and that remembering it loudly, clearly, and without compromise is the only way to ensure that such silence is never mistaken for safety again.